everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, welcome to my Astro community.
Business change, I like I ain't all this. Get in without my main focus.
In today's video, we're going to be talking about marriage and astrology. And specifically, we're going to be answering the question, will we get married? And how we could see that in our personal birth chart. I will set the disclaimer that ultimately marriage is your free will, so you can get married if you want to, or if you don't want to, you don't have to. But this video is just really based on astrology and how we could see marriage in your chart. So if your chart isn't favorable to marriage, don't feel discouraged. If it is favorable, don't feel like you have to get married. Okay, so when it comes to marriage and astrology, of course, we can look at the 7th house. Now, the 7th house in astrology is the house of marriage. On another level, it is the house of contracts, right? Marriage is a contract. And we could see, and really with the 7th house, we can see one-on-one relationships and ultimately who we may or may not marry. So it's important to get very familiar with your 7th house. So the second step to this whole process for understanding marriage in your chart is to look at your 7th house ruler. Now, I do explain house rulerships in another video on my channel, so if you're a little bit new to this or you're a beginner, you don't know what I'm talking about, you can watch that video too. But anyway, the 7th house ruler is going to be the planet that rules the sign of your 7th house. So for example, if you're somebody with a Sagittarius 7th house, that means Jupiter is your 7th house ruler. And so your 7th house ruler, the planet that rules your 7th house, is going to be the most instrumental, most vital planet to look at when we are determining marriage and the favorability of marriage for you personally or the unfavorability for it. So for my third step, we're going to see where that 7th house ruler is placed. Now, this is the most vital part of this entire video, and if you guys take nothing from this video, you should understand really where your 7th house ruler is placed in your chart. Obviously, it's not always going to be in your 7th house. It might be in your 8th house, 12th house, wherever. It's really important to understand what your house ruler is and where it is placed. So I'm not going to explain the 7th house ruler in every single house. If you guys want me to do like a separate video about that, I will. But really quickly, the favorable houses for your 7th house ruler to be in are houses 3, 5, 7, 9, 10, and 11. So I'll put that on the screen, and these are pretty favorable houses for marriage. Like I said, I can't get too deep into it right now. If you guys want like a separate video about that, I can do it. But these are mostly generally known as the favorable houses for marriage. And as I said in the beginning, if you don't have your like 7th house ruler in these houses, don't feel discouraged. Marriage is still possible for you. And then that brings me to the unfavorable houses for marriage. So some unfavorable houses for marriage are houses 1, 6, 8, and 12. And as I said, you know, you can still get married. It's not like, you know, too discouraging for you, but these are houses where relationships may manifest in a more challenging way. With the favorable houses, marriage or relationships might manifest in a more advantageous or prosperous way. However, these houses might cause a little bit more challenge. However, marriage is still possible. And then of course, for the 4th step, we're going to look at the aspects your 7th house ruler is making. And again, this is another vital part. So as I mentioned, the 7th house ruler, like the house it's in, is very vital. And then the aspects it's making is the two most vital information pieces in this video. So really, if your 7th house ruler is making a lot of positive aspects, of course, this would be very advantageous for marriage. And I do have a whole video about aspects already on my channel, so you guys can watch that if you are a little bit new. But again, for a refresher, positive aspects could be trine, sextile, and potentially conjunction depending on the planet. So to continue with my earlier example, let's say your 7th house is Sagittarius, and that means Jupiter is your 7th house ruler, but let's say Jupiter is conjunction Venus. That is a very auspicious symbol for marriage. It almost guarantees a very prosperous marriage because Venus is about fertility. It is about beauty, harmony, peace. So this is a very lucky thing to have if you have your 7th house ruler conjunct Venus. It doesn't have to be Jupiter. Let's say your 7th house ruler is Capricorn. But let's say your 7th house ruler is Capricorn and then Saturn in your chart is conjunct Venus in like the 9th house. That is very auspicious. That is very lucky. That is something that is very conducive to marriage. Similarly, let's say Jupiter, let's go with Jupiter for the same example, is sextiling Venus, or Jupiter is trining Venus. If Jupiter is trining, or your 7th house ruler really is trining, sextile, or conjunction any benefic planets, so let's say it is trining, sextile, Jupiter or Venus, this is very auspicious for marriage. If in general, and ultimately in general, if your 7th house ruler is touching or in good aspect to other planets, then marriage would be very favorable for you. And in astrology, we would ultimately call this your 7th house ruler being in good condition. If your 7th house ruler is not in good condition, then marriage might be more challenging for you. Of course, it's still possible, but it's more challenging. Whereas if your 7th house ruler was in good condition. And so if your planets are also aspecting the malefics, so let's say your 7th house ruler again is Jupiter, and it's not in good aspect. Like let's say it's not in good condition, so that would mean like your Jupiter is like squaring Saturn, your Jupiter is like squaring Venus, your Jupiter is squaring or opposition, which are those negative aspects, right? Those challenging aspects, certain planets, then marriage might be more challenging for you. So for example, if you had your 7th house ruler, let's say Jupiter, opposition Mars, that would mean your marriage might be a little bit, it could suggest violence, it could suggest a lot of ego battles, it could suggest just a lot of fighting or quarrels. Not always, don't take that and run with it, but Mars is a very aggressive planet, so to have that influencing your 7th house ruler in a negative way, that would kind of suggest maybe a more challenging marriage. Okay, so for my 5th step, we're really going to look at what planets are in the 7th house. So of course, if you have the malefics in your 7th house, that can suggest marriage might be more challenging for you. I will put a picture of the malefic planets on the screen. So off the top of my head, obviously it's going to be Mars in the 7th, Saturn in the 7th, of course, Sun in the 7th, or if you have your North Node or South Node in the 7th house, those are considered very challenging placements because it does either delay marriage, cause instability with marriage, it might just not cause marriage to not happen for you at all, depending on your entire chart here. But those are the malefic planets. Obviously, North Node and South Node aren't planets, but they're still considered malefic in astrology. So if you have those malefic planets or energy in your 7th house, that does kind of skew your potential for marriage quite a bit. But again, we have to look at all the details for a personal chart. And ultimately, having the malefics in your 7th house is somewhat unfavorable, but it doesn't really eliminate the possibility for marriage. But if you do have the benefic planets, I'll put the benefic planets on the screen. Obviously, Jupiter is very beneficial. Venus is very beneficial. Having the benefic planets in your 7th house suggests a very prosperous marriage, a very harmonious marriage, a marriage where you really do gain things or really profit or profit in more of a spiritual or emotional sense from the union of two people. And overall, having the benefics in your 7th house is very favorable and suggests more of a prosperous marriage and suggests really having a marriage that you would really like to have. Okay, last but not least, the last step, we're going to specifically see who our marriage partner is in our chart. So in our chart, it's different for men and women and different for your sexuality. But ultimately, in traditional astrology, for a woman, let's say you're a woman and you like men and you want to marry a man, you would look at Jupiter in your chart. Whereas conversely, if you're a man and let's say you like women, that means you're going to look at Venus in your chart. And then of course, if you like the same sex, you're just going to look at that corresponding planet. So if you're a man and you like men, you would look at Jupiter. If you're a woman, you like women, you would look at Venus. So just to touch on the women really quickly. So if you're a woman that likes men, you're going to look at Jupiter, see the condition of Jupiter, see where Jupiter is placed, see what house it's in. Like I said, look to see at the favorable houses, look at the favorable aspects, the unfavorable aspects, look at everything that's going on with your Jupiter. And I think the most important part of this too is to look at the sign your Jupiter is in. And really the sign that Jupiter is in is going to show you kind of like the quality of your husband. It's obviously a very objective, in an objective sense. It's not really specific, but it just shows you like, okay, your husband might be this person, or might be upstanding, or might be responsible. If your Jupiter is in good condition, that means your husband will be also in alignment with that. So really quickly, I'm going to list the unfavorable signs for Jupiter to be in. If your Jupiter is in these signs, it's not like your husband won't be like the best husband for you, but you might have more challenges finding that partner who meets your standards. You might attract partners that are not too favorable at first. Overall, it does consider more of a challenge with the partner you might choose. Just by having your planet in these signs. So those signs would be Capricorn, Gemini, or Virgo. And if you have your Jupiter in these signs, it might be more challenging to find a husband that is worthwhile. And then the favorable signs for Jupiter would be Pisces, Sagittarius, or Cancer. So if you have your Jupiter in those signs, you might have an easier time finding a husband that is worthwhile, that is favorable, that will be upstanding and aligned with your standards. And then of course we can't forget about the guys. So for guys, you're going to look at the condition of your Venus. So as I mentioned, the same logic applies as with like girls looking at Jupiter in their chart for a man. So as a man, you want to look at Venus in your chart for your potential wife. And really the condition of Venus is going to show you whether your wife is going to be someone that is pleasant, or somebody that aligns with your standards, or somebody you will ultimately have a very harmonious marriage with. So you can just apply the logic I mentioned in this video. So you want to look at the house that Venus is in, see the aspects it's making. If it's making a lot of squares or oppositions, or if it's making trines and sextiles, if it's making conjunctions, if it's in favorable houses, if it's in unfavorable houses. Consider all of the knowledge I said in this video and apply it to your Venus sign. But right now, what I will tell you guys is that Venus does have favorable signs and unfavorable signs. So the unfavorable signs Venus can be in for you are Scorpio, Aries, and Virgo. So if you have your Venus in these signs, it doesn't mean you won't get married or you won't have a pleasant wife or wife that you want necessarily. It just means that you might have some challenges when with this person you might marry, or have challenge finding the woman that meets your standards, or finding the woman that you ultimately want to marry. There can be some challenges there if you have your Venus sign in those signs. And then some favorable signs for Venus to be in is, of course, Pisces, Libra, and Taurus. If you have your Venus in those signs, marriage is a little bit more favorable for you. Again, you do have to consider the entire chart and all the knowledge I mentioned in this video. But those are just generally the most favorable signs for your Venus to be in, and favorable when you want to find a wife that you are happy with. Okay, so now I'm going to do a birth chart reading example. Now this is an example I would do if I was doing a personal reading for someone. So I'm going to put a chart on the screen. I'm going to be looking at my phone at the chart as well. And so we're going to go through the steps I mentioned in this video. So in this chart, this person is a Scorpio rising. So their 7th house is in Taurus. So right away with this 7th house in Taurus, this really suggests to me that they find themselves in relationships that are very stable. They might attract partners who are somewhat possessive, maybe partners who are somewhat materialistic as well. Either way, you can imagine the Taurus themes are very prevalent in this person's love life. And this person also might prefer monogamy as well, because Taurus is a very monogamous sign. It's also a very traditional sign, so they might prefer very traditional relationship dynamics. But if we look at the 7th house ruler, that 7th house ruler is Venus, and that is in the 9th house. So having the 7th house ruler in the 9th house really suggests to me that this person might attract partners who are very geared towards freedom. The 9th house is about freedom. It is about spirituality. It is all about expansion and optimism. So maybe they attract people who embody those traits, but I think for this chart, they would manifest as mostly attracting people who might teach them something. Ninth house is the house of higher education, so they might attract someone who kind of feels like a mentor or feels like they are their like professor almost, or like a teacher in some way. And then also ninth house does rule foreign lands and travel, so they might date someone or marry someone who is from another country, or they literally might meet their spouse in another country, or kind of prefer their partner to be from another culture from them. But their ninth house ruler is squaring Pluto, so this can be challenging for them just because it suggests maybe really attracting jealous partners or possessive partners, or partners who are very controlling in some way, because Pluto does rule those negative aspects. And they also might attract partners where they experience extremes with them somehow, like a love-hate relationship, or a relationship where they really love each other one day and then they really hate each other. At worst, this can manifest as a toxic relationship, or just very toxic themes within the relationship, because their seventh house ruler does square Pluto. And their Venus isn't really receiving any positive aspects. So just that alone shows that marriage might be a challenge for them. I think marriage is in their cards. It is possible, but it is a bit of a challenge just because they have Pluto influencing their seventh house. But their Venus, aka the seventh house ruler, does conjunct their midheaven, so they might date or marry someone who is quite popular, who is quite famous. This can be something where it's like they date someone who is in a position of power. Also, since their Venus is in the ninth house, like I said, there can be this theme of mentorship, like a teacher, someone who is kind of like their superior in some way is someone they might date or be interested in. And ultimately their husband might have those traits, because let's say this is a girl's chart. Okay, so let's go back to that seventh house. So they have their Mars in the seventh house, which is kind of challenging. That is a malefic, right? That is kind of not the best or most favorable planet to have in the seventh house. This does suggest maybe attracting violent partners. At worst, violent partners, maybe partners who are very egotistical, very macho, very masculine, maybe partners who are very aggressive too. However, the saving grace of this chart though is that their Mars is well aspected, so their Mars might not give them too many negative aspects, even though it is a malefic planet, but it might give them a little bit of an egotistical husband, a husband that is aggressive, maybe one. I feel like this can manifest as attracting a husband who is like the bad boy archetype, or some aspect of her husband might be a bit reckless or daredevil-y, or someone that isn't super calm and just like regular and like a boring person. This might manifest as her attracting a man who is very reckless, daredevil, very aggressive maybe. This also suggests she might attract a husband who is an athlete. Again, she has her seventh house ruler conjunct her midheaven, so she might attract a famous athlete or an athlete of high status. But Mars does rule athleticism, it does rule the physical body. So she might attract someone who does work with their physical body for a living, maybe like a firefighter or something like that. Either way, he might have a profession that involves sports, his physical body, or something like that. And then in terms of their relationship dynamic, they might have a dynamic where they have a lot of petty fights. Like I said, Mars is the planet of aggression and kind of like fighting or violence. And it might not manifest literally as violence, but literally them just like bickering a lot or fighting a lot or things like that. So overall, just from the seventh house alone, we can understand that one, she wants a monogamous or very traditional marriage because of Taurus, seventh house. With her seventh house ruler in the ninth house, she does value freedom in the relationship. She might have a husband that is like a mentor to her, someone that teaches her things, someone that might be older than her. She might date someone famous or of high status. And then lastly, because of Mars, she might date someone who is maybe aggressive, who might be in a physical driven career, who might be a bit egotistical or reckless, or even like a daredevil bad boy archetype. So last but not least, we can look at the quality and condition of her Jupiter. So again, her Jupiter is in the ninth house, so having this ninth house energy really surrounded around her, you know, marriage and potential husband. She might have a husband that is very ninth house themed, so maybe he has planets in the ninth house, maybe he's a Sagittarius, but either way, with the ninth house, again, it's this theme of education, this theme of travel, knowledge, different cultures. So she really might marry someone from a different culture than her. Jupiter is in the sign of Leo, so it isn't in detriment, but it's not in exaltation either, but Jupiter does pretty well in Leo. So overall, she might have a very generous husband because Leo does rule generosity, it rules luxury and gifts. So maybe she has a very generous husband who gives her a lot of gifts and gives her a lot of affection, or is just very generous in general. So again, her Jupiter doesn't have too many aspects, but it is sextile Mars. So this is a really great aspect, and again, it kind of helps her Mars out just a bit because Mars is a malefic planet, but the fact that Mars is well aspected and is aspected to Jupiter especially does suggest she will benefit more so from the positive aspects of Mars. So again, she might have a very protective, very masculine partner, a partner who kind of will do anything for her, be very possessive of her, anything like that's positive about Mars, she might experience with her husband. And overall, she might be very active with her husband too. I can really see this manifesting as her like almost like being like, let's say they open up a gym together, or they're very active together, they go on hikes, they work out together. I can really see this manifesting as a very active couple, maybe even like traveling together. This is a very exciting type of energy because she has Jupiter sextile Mars, it's in the 9th house, and then she has her Venus in the 9th house too. So with this 9th house energy, it really does suggest a very optimistic, exciting relationship overall. So overall, I would say this person's chart is very favorable for marriage. Obviously, it does have its like setbacks or challenging aspects, but I would say it's very favorable. On a scale of 1 to 10, it's not like the perfect chart, right? There is no perfect chart. But it's not necessarily like the perfect chart, but it's not necessarily like the worst case scenario ever. So she might fall in the middle with a husband or marriage she does choose to engage in. So I would say it's maybe like a 7 or something. On the scale of favorability. Like I said, it's not perfect, but it's not terrible either. So this person specifically would have a very favorable marriage.